Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Last week we talked to a scientist about the secular scientific aspects around sex. And one of the first things we talked about, briefly, is where sex and gender come from. That both of those go back to the very earliest stages of biological evolution, to such an early stage that it didn't or couldn't leave any fossil evidence of this groundbreaking new feature or function. And I mentioned that intelligent design, which is really a creationist ideology inside a pseudo-scientific Trojan horse, that attributing human sexuality to intelligent design really makes a mockery of the designer. It makes the designer no different from a crackpot architect who creates a new kind of bathroom or kitchen that features a unique hole in the wall where you set the lever this way and it becomes a sewer system connected to the toilet, and flip the lever the other way and now it becomes a door to the oven that you can put in the dough and out pops the muffins or the loaf of bread. Not an intelligent designer, if you ask me, Scott.
Yeah. You tell us how you really feel, Luke.
Just having some fun.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But there's many analogies, I guess, that you could come up with. But that's particularly good.
But today we want to come at this from another angle that we couldn't broach with our scientific expert. Today we're going to come at this from a more theological angle. And to people who still want to find some way to say that God created this wonderful thing called sex, that God gave it a whole new level of beauty and intimacy in humans, for those people, I have to ask why God gave us such strong biological urges for reproduction, powerful, almost uncontrollable hormones that kick in as soon as we reach puberty and start noticing others, other people, other genders, or sometimes even the same gender, years before one is ready for marriage, let alone raising children, and also gave us all the anatomical equipment to experience and enjoy intense sexual pleasure, but then placed all kinds of prohibitive religious rules around all of that.
You know, there's a quote I heard not long ago from Voltaire. He said, "God made sex, priests made marriage," and he's kind of getting at that point, right? That
Right.
We've added all of these prohibitions and stipulations and so on around this very powerful part of our being, and this has not changed. Here we are as an quote, supposedly advanced civilization, but sex is still one of the big topic of the day. We're
Yes.
still, and not just in the religious sphere, but in the secular sphere as well. So yeah, we're dealing with a extremely fundamental human drive, right?
So instead, sex and gender look to me like very important and valuable evolutionary adaptations, both being very powerful and potentially disruptive to society. And so, yes, a strong argument can be made for putting up some fences around that kind of a raging bull. And those among us who are inclined to believe in a divinity can even say that some of that fence making is divinely inspired. But religions have jumped all over that, and basically they've quite muddied the waters. So in today's episode and the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to explore how and why religion has done that. Of course, we're particularly interested in how Christianity in general, and evangelicalism in particular, how they've grappled with this subject. Those will be our topics for next week and beyond when we ask Christian scholars why this is such a big issue. But the track record that Christians have on this subject leads me to predict with high certainty, we haven't talked to them yet, but I expect fully that much of their argumentation and logic on this will have them pointing at passages in what they will call the Old Testament. Those passages are foundational for much of Christian thinking on this subject. But those scriptures were written by Jews, by people who practiced Judaism thousands of years ago. And so who better to talk to about those passages than a Jewish scholar of Judaism? So we reached out to Dr. Evyatar Marienberg from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's in the Department of Religious Studies there, and his expertise is the beliefs and practices of Jews and Christians all through history. And he also grew up in a Jewish home, so he has firsthand personal knowledge of the experience of being a Jew, reading the Torah, although he's not a practicing Jew at this time. And, to top it all off, the title of his most recent book is Traditional Jewish Sex Guidance, a History. So who else is better suited for this topic? Evyatar, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. I'm sure there are many other people that are even better suited, but thank you anyway.
We're very happy to have you here today.
I'm very happy to be here.
What kind of a Jewish home did you grow up in? Was it a conservative home, or was it more reformed, or
I grew up in an Orthodox home,
Orthodox?
what is called modern Orthodox, but on the relatively strict side of modern Orthodoxy in Israel, to parents that both were born in Israel or pre-48, so Palestine at the time, and with grandparents from both sides that came from Europe, left just after Hitler got to power. So pre-Holocaust, but definitely influenced by the events of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But the household was very observant. Every detail, every part of the law were extremely observed. I grew up also in the Jewish and Israeli religious educational system through my life. I've been in what called yeshiva for many years, Talmudic institutes, and I've been an observant Orthodox guy probably until the age of close to 30. I am 51 now.
Okay, thank you.
So, Evyatar, in the second half of today's episode, we're going to look at some very specific passages in the Torah that Christians frequently point back to when they justify their theological positions on sex. But before we get into those specifics, I thought we should look broadly across the full corpus of Jewish law, at least that part of it that we find in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and pull out some general themes. And before we do that, I think we should just give the listeners a bit of a description of that Jewish law. For starters, we can talk about its sheer scope and size. I hear there's over 600 laws, 600 covering all aspects of life. So can you give us a bird's eye view of that whole body of law, but without saying anything specifically yet about gender or sex?
Wow, this is definitely a big question. I would like to make some comments about things that you said, because I think they're important.
Sure.
One thing is you said that the Torah or the Hebrew Bible was written by Jews. As scholars, we would not say that. Jews and Judaism are concepts that are invented only towards the end of the Second Temple period. So we would say they were written by Israelites or some other name that we are going to use. We do not consider as a scholar that Judaism exists as Judaism at the time that the Bible was written, but that's Israelite religions or some other terms. Another thing I would like, and this is from what I seem to understand, you are geared mostly towards Protestant type of Christianity. I would like to say that the idea that Jews have some authorship or better understanding of the Hebrew Bible because they are Jews and Christians need to feel kind of inferior, I do not agree with that.
Okay.
This is a text. I did not write the Bible, nor my parents. This is an old text. It's far from my time as it's far from yours. I would say the only advantages that I might have is mastering the linguistic of it myself, but that's not many old Jews. The different levels of Hebrew there, being able to read in the original, even though original, even that's a questionable term because many years passed and words change and reality change. So, but I think that other than that, I do not think that Christians should feel kind of inferior and ask the Jews what do they say, and that be the right interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. I do not see that as appropriate.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Okay. Now you said about the commandments. So first, there is a traditional number of 613 commandments that's supposed to be in the Jewish law, but this is a medieval number. It was not early medieval, probably in Talmudic period we already find it. So found in the first centuries. But first, they are not clear what they are. These commandments, we have several, at least the two major composition in the Middle Ages. There are more than that, but I would say there are more than that try to enumerate the 613. They are not the same, meaning the number existed, and then scholars try to to take all the laws and to put them in a way that they come to 613. So the number existed regardless of the actual reality. If people would like to have a simple test to see what it means, so I can tell listeners to open the so-called 10 Commandments and to count the commandments. And I can tell you that some might reach 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Some might even say 14 they are there. There's a text that is divided to, in a way, different ways, but it's not obvious that there are 10 there, just like not obvious that there are 613. Another thing to say is that even if we count those 613 as the medieval authors did, the vast majority of them are related to Bible activity, to sacrifice and others. Meaning, since the year 70 CE, and I use CE Common Era, since the year 70 CE, they are irrelevant. So even if a pious Jew would like to keep all 613, they can't. There is no temple to do the vast majority of them. Now, if we speak about the type of laws, so we have, yes, so most laws seems to be, or the Jewish tradition takes as most important those that are in the Torah itself, in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, even though there are other things that are mentioned in prophets and in other places. Sometimes they are mentioned as a fact. People did this, people do that in a story, in a narrative, and sometimes they are given as some kind of what one should do. But mostly the commandment style, the one should do, is indeed in the Torah, in the first 5 books. They are found everywhere theoretically, but in reality, they are concentrated mostly in some collections, what scholars call codes. For example, in the book of Genesis, there are very few, maybe 3, 4. Again, this is subjective. Most of the commandments will be in the other books, in the other 4 books. The book of Deuteronomy will repeat many of those that exist in previous books. So the bulk of them will be probably, I never counted, but will be Leviticus, but this will mostly be sacrifices related. Exodus before that, and Numbers will have much of thing, and with Deuteronomy, many repetitions. The laws cover many things. Sometimes they are organized by topic, can be by holiday, by season, by agricultural issues, about slaves, about issues of damages. Sometimes they are arranged, sometimes they are just here and there, sometimes they are written as a commandment, sometimes they are part of a narrative. So there are many of them, but there is a big line between them and the Jewish law in the fact that sometimes 1 or 2 mentions in the Bible became a huge thing in Jewish law, and at the same time that many other so-called commandments in the Bible became very minor or relatively minor in Jewish law. So the Bible is extremely important for that, but it's just a very small part of the Jewish law itself.
Okay. And there's one aspect of this that I wanted, this general description that I wanted to make sure that we covered, was basically the timeline from which this law came to the Israelites. The earlier part of the Torah, if we talk about Genesis, you would refer to that as the book of Bereshit, I understand. That describes about 1,000 years from the time of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all the kids that they had in Egypt for 400 years, until we get to Israel leaving Egypt. All of that period is basically 1,000 years, and that all preceded the issuing of the law. You know, Moses and the Israelites in the desert for 40 years. That's where all of that law that you just described came out during that 40-year period. But for 1,000 years, it didn't seem that God was too concerned about giving them these laws, which, as we're going to talk today, included a lot of these sexual laws. So any comments on that point?
It's a question that bothered the Jewish authors for a long time. Again, I would say some of the things you have assumption of faith that I respect, but I cannot share. I do not know what God did or what God did not. I do not know if there is God or if there isn't. This is not my problem. I'm talking about this as a cultural, as stories, and
Sure.
The question of faith is not related. Counting of the time of the Torah is very complicated, and there are different theories about that. It became traditional when people want to know the age of the world. But for example, you see often the counting is people counted from, let's say if there were 2 people of different span of life, so they would say this is when the end of the one begins the other, etc., things that are not really realistic. Or counting, one should have big faith to believe that some people lived 900 years. So some of the things, I cannot say how long it was. What we can say that if there have been something similar to Exodus from Egypt, it would have been probably around the 13th, 14th century BCE. That we can say. If the Israelites would have been in the desert, which scholars doubt they've ever been, it would be around that time, around, let's say, the 13th, 12th century BC. And there are the stories before. Again, to show example of numbers, you spoke about 400 years in Egypt, but if you look in a different verse, you'll find 210. The Bible itself did not decide how long it is. So numbers are very cool, but not to rely too much upon, I would say.
Sure.
But the real question is, what about all the so-called patriarch and matriarchs? And then the authors in traditional Judaism were dealing with the question, and there are different concepts. Some would say that they did not keep these laws. Some would say they did. A funny example is that it's a kind of a joke, but it's a good example. When there is a story of the three peoples or angels, or according to Christian medieval author Trinity, coming to visit Abraham after he circumcised himself, these three figures, he is said to give them in Hebrew, so butter, milk, and the meat, basically the kids of that, right. Them. And according to Jewish law, you cannot eat milk and meat together. So that would be a non-kosher meal. Now, some would say, well, he gave them first the milk and the butter and then the meat, which is legit in Jewish law. You cannot do the other way around or mixing, but you can offer first milk and then take some time in meat. But this is an example of how to say that, or the different or other different issues there. So some scholars from the Talmudic period would say that they kept Jewish law, and some did not. How they kept it, or because it was, as can say, subscribed on their heart, or because they have their own revelation. But there are really different opinions on that among the Jewish authors of antiquity.
Would it be fair to say, from kind of a minimalist perspective, that the law comes to the forefront of Israel's history when Israel becomes a nation, when they become a distinct people? Now they need a body of law to manage that distinct people. Is that fair to say?
I think that's great. That's the way the Torah is presenting it. The Torah is presenting is that the people became a nation, an am, that's the Hebrew word, with the Exodus. So I think it makes sense to say, right, before that, these are tribes, these are families. Now it's a nation, so you need to have a code of law for them.
Right. Okay.
And I just want to clarify, partly for you, Evyatar, but also for our listeners, I'm not trying to establish the historicity of, for example, Noah and Adam and the 400 years in Egypt, that sort of thing. I'm not trying to establish the historicity of it. Instead, the point I'm trying to make here is that when we do talk to Christians next week and beyond about these questions about sex and gender and sexuality, they will inevitably point to Leviticus. And I wanted to make the point, well, that law that we find in Leviticus seemed to just pop into history during that 40-year period, supposedly when Moses was leading Israel through the desert. But for 1,000 years, according to the stories that precede it, for 1,000 years, God apparently didn't seem to care about these laws around sex. So that's really all I'm trying to do. I'm making a point to those when we speak to the Christian audience later.
Yes, I'm not, again, you speak about specific law, or you speak about law in general?
The laws in general, but we should now get into some of these laws about sex and gender and sexuality.
I can say that there are examples in which Jewish law later tried to see, for example, issue of polygamy. So in Genesis, different of the guys there have several wives. So then the question is, polygamy is legit or not? So there is no law in Genesis says that a man can marry multiple wives. There are texts in other places that assume this is a reality. And then later in Jewish law, when polygamy is basically become forbidden, will be the question, but the patriarchs did that, right? So there are this question about using stories from Genesis as well. But it's true that in Genesis, Jewish tradition sees very few commandments. It sees one of the most famous one is the procreation. Another one is circumcision. And there are possibly some others, what we call the Noahide laws, possibly hinted or understood to be hinted, and a few other things. But mostly the laws are not in the book of Genesis.
Okay. So then let's get into some of these laws around sex and gender that we find in this book of Leviticus. And these are going to be general and broad brush statements that I want to get from you first. So the first thing I think that that I think we're going to find out when we look at this is that sex and gender are literally dirty words, because the Levitical laws often speak about clean and unclean. And so we'll want to talk a bit about what that means. But many of the laws that we find in Leviticus, they refer to, and I'm at a loss for words, I'm going to use the word secretions that we find that come from genitalia. Men having wet dreams, women having their periods. Both of those secretions, in air quotes, causing people and things to become unclean. And yet, to my knowledge, there's not a single mention of other secretions, in air quotes, that come from other parts of the body. There's no specific laws about saliva or vomit from the mouth, or the various kinds of boogers from the nose, the wax that comes out of our ears, the sweat from our forehead or our armpits, the dust bunnies out of our belly buttons, or even, quite frankly, the waste of our digestive tract. Nothing is said about any of those, again, secretions, and yet there are numerous laws around what comes from the male and female genitalia. So what does that say about the attitude that these laws have towards sex and gender and clean and unclean?
It's a good question. First, I would say the issue of secretion, the issue of toilet etiquette is mentioned in the Torah. There is the obligation to cover, to
bury
cover
it
with dirt, to bury whatever comes out. So it might be good against flies, I'm sure, but at least it is mentioned. So it can be considered to be a commandment. It was understood like this. But you're right that there are some secretions that are more than others. And I think mostly the vast majority are related to blood. So one can say these are related. I think so. I mean, you can say these related to sex, but another person say this is about blood. And scholars debate why. I personally think that because blood is scary. Blood normally is supposed to be inside. Blood is normally something we're not supposed to see. And moments in which it comes out, or moments in which something from the body comes out in a way that is unexpected, that is irregular, that is not considered to generally healthy situation, is, I think, often discussed. One of them that is very obviously clear, the issue is the menstruation, and I feel bad that we are three guys speaking here about that, but that's okay. That's the reality of this recording. Menstruation, from a perspective of, if one does not, let's say like this, if one does not know about menstrual cycle, so the idea that suddenly blood comes out from the body should be a scary thing. And we do know that many girls that were not told, were not prepared to that event, this can be a very scary moment because we do not expect blood to come out. So I think many of the issue of purity and impurity are situations in which something is considered to be irregular, something considered to be not what normally should be with a healthy person. I think so it's true that many of them are related to sexuality, but I think it's also that issue as well.
But tie in this concept of clean and unclean, because I understand what you're saying about how this sudden appearance of blood can be a scary thing, but there's also an element of clean and unclean. The woman becomes unclean for a period of time. She has to go through a cleansing ritual. And I understand that the clothes can become unclean because of this. So what is that? What's happening there? What does that mean?
So I think the issue of purity and purity, again, is very hard for us to understand. But let's say if you have a coffee mug and you wake up, I don't know if you drink coffee, but if you do,
yes.
If you wake up one morning and in your coffee mug, there is a cockroach. Now, scientifically, if you take that cockroach, get it out, live or dead, wash it very well, put it in the dishwasher maybe, I don't think microscope could reveal anything that a cockroach was there. But I think many of us will feel some disgust using that cup after that, and maybe we'll say, you know what, I'll get rid of that. So I think there is this something of, again, this is not scientific. There is nothing there of the cockroach that was there, but there is some kind of feeling of disgust, of something that was not supposed to be there. And sometimes I feel that impurity is a bit like that. It is the idea that a certain element was in a place and we have to get rid of it. And we have to get rid of it in different ways. So it can be that some people will have their own ritual cleaning of mug after an insect was there. I do not know. They will put it outside. They will blow around it. They will put some smoke around it. I do not know. And that will make them feel, okay, now it's really clean. They will put it, use bleach, okay, whatever. So I think often the issue of impurity is related to that, is this kind of feeling that something that was not supposed to be touched the object or came out of the person, and we need to have a certain ritual to get rid of it. So it's not just cleaning, it's some extra steps that are there. And it exists in many religious cultures. So Jews, there's nothing special about this. Many groups have similar concepts. Another thing I want to say about the issue of clean and not clean, sometimes this is the question of purity and impurity. And the translation would say not clean, while the Hebrew would say what we generally would understand to be not pure, impure. Now, the question of what impurity is and what is not is a question that sociologists for many decades deal with, trying to understand what is purity and impurity. It is true that in some culture, in some context, it can be related to some kind of dirt or not. But I would say it's more, generally, I would say it feels to be more something like a spiritual kind of disgust or spiritual dirt. It's not an actual something that you can see, you can feel. It's some feeling of something that is not right, I would say. So I'm not sure that the clean or not clean will be the perfect term, even that it's true often translations use those terms.
If I can ask another question, Christian theologians often divide the law into what they'll call, the ceremonial law versus the moral law. Do Jewish scholars do that? Is that something that? No,
this was something that Christian Thomas Aquinas was big on that. He actually maybe one that developed that theory of the ceremonial and the moral, because he was trying to deal with the very complicated question why some laws should be observed by Christians while others not. So he created those distinctions. From a Jewish perspective, no, there is no distinction like this. It can be the issue of justification of things, but there is no any major distinction I can think of.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the first broad brush statement I wanted to cover. Here's a second one. When I page through these Torah laws, there's numerous laws about who one cannot have sex with. And it's really interesting how it delineates this. The text, at least in one place, gives a long list of the people whom a man can't have sex with, mostly relatives of that man. And it's interesting the way it puts it. It says, for example, not with your father's wife, or your uncle's wife, or your brother's wife, or your cousin's wife, or your neighbor's wife, or your cousin or your sister. But it never simply says you may only have sex with your one and only wife, period. That would be easy and simple, but it doesn't rule out multiple wives. There's this nebulous title, concubines, that we come across, and there seems to be laws relating to females taken as prisoners of war who men can have their way with. And then, as you said, there are many examples of high-profile men who have more than one wife. Abraham, Isaac, Esau, Jacob. Jacob had 4 wives. David had 8. Solomon had 700. So, and I also notice, to my knowledge, the laws don't rule out premarital sex for teenagers. So a lot of words to say that the sex is never specifically tied to a marriage relationship. It doesn't just simply say you may only have sex with your one and only wife. And as an aside, there's never even anything said about marriage ceremonies and marriage rituals and marriage vows. It's just, so I've done enough talking, Evyatar. What do we do about all of that?
You're right in everything. My question is, what's the question?
The question is that it would be easy if they just simply said, you may only have one wife, men may only have one wife. And of course, we're talking ancient times. This is not today. But if they just simply said, you may only have sex with your one wife, but it says, okay, so not that guy's wife and not his wife and not his wife and not that wife. And it doesn't even say kids should not have sex until they're married. It just doesn't seem to be tied to marriage. And yet today, that's so central to the argumentation of many Christians. It has to be within a monogamous marriage relationship. And yet they'll base their argument on what they would call Old Testament laws.
Well, let me ask Evyatar, if you don't mind, to Lou's point. Yes, the Christian tradition is very strong on the whole marriage issue being the only appropriate place for sexual relations and so on. But what about the Jewish tradition? What does it have to say on that subject, for example?
What first I want to say about both of you say, but mostly what Luke. So Luke is surprised that the Bible does not say what he thinks the Bible should say. And I would say, why should the Bible say what Luke wants to say? I mean, it's like someone from Texas coming to Finland and say, oh, the laws here are different. Why you don't just use our Texan laws? Because we don't. I mean, why would the Bible does not assume one wife? The Bible does not assume necessarily some ceremony of marriage as we know it. The Bible does not assume that the relations with minors are not acceptable. So yes, the Bible does not say what you want to say because the Bible doesn't owe you that, really, to say it bluntly. The Bible does not have the New Testament Jesus claim about one wives. Fair enough.
And I just want to clarify again, it isn't I want the Jewish laws to say what Luke wants to say. I'm saying when I talk to Christians next week, Christian scholars or others next week, and they're going to say, well, it's because it says in Leviticus, and that's what they will base their argument on.
Right.
And I want to be able to say, you know what, I talked to a Hebrew scholar, and he says, you know what, it's not in there. Your argument falls flat. So
right. Yes, but I can also say, I mean, some Christian would say Jewish family values or family values. And family values include minor marriages, including concubines, including selling your daughter, including having multiple wives, including many things that generally are not to be understood in so-called family values, which means that these family values have nothing to do with the Bible. They are invention and modern invention of Christians, and they want to search in the Bible to justify their claim. Again, I apologize, but the Bible doesn't have to do that. So this is their thing, which I respect. I'm not saying that I have nothing to say that a law that was written in, let's say, 8th century BCE is more valuable than a law that was written in 1950. Okay,
right.
But I think it's wrong to pretend that it's come from there. You want to have your own, you want to say so-called your own families, not you, some people, their own family values. Okay, you define your family values, but the idea that you try to say, oh, this is in the Bible, it's not. So people read selectively their own scriptures, and they can do that. Is it like honest intellectually? No, but religion does not have to be not judged by being honest intellectually. This is their thing. But to pretend that that some value that they want is in some place and then to be surprised when it's not, I think there's a logical problem there.
Okay.
Thank that's very well said. I think for Christians, especially in the evangelical tradition, the Bible is this ultimate authority. So by appealing to it, they believe that they could nail these things down with great certainty. So that's why they do that. That's why they appeal to it. But I agree with what you're saying. That's highly problematic. Well, one question that I have, though, is, so the writers of the what we refer to as the New Testament, the Gospels and so on, are primarily Jewish writers. Paul in particular wrote about half of the New Testament. And of course, he's a trained Pharisee and so on. And all of a sudden, you do have a lot of material in there about sex and about perversion and things of that nature and so on. Where do you think that comes from a Jewish perspective? Like, does that indicate that Judaism in Paul's time had developed those kind of things, or is that Paul just creating something de novo? As a completely new concept given his conversion to Christianity? I'm just curious.
I want to come to this, but I want one thing to say before. When you said about many Christian evangelical treat the Bible as authority, the Bible does not speak by itself. You have to read it, you have to interpret it. So they see their own subjective interpretation, understanding of the Bible in the light of what they believe to be the message of the New Testament, in the light of what they believe to be incarnation, in the light of what they believe to be the Christ and all those things. Then they go back to the Old Testament and they believe to find it what they want to find. Which is, again, fun and interesting, but I cannot say that this is, I mean, if it doesn't work, it's not my responsibility to
Right.
Right. Now go back to Paul. Paul, like any person, I mean, very few people, if at all, are outside of their culture.
Right.
I mean, even the most genius people, they built something extra, right? They're not extra, like, some ETs. Paul was a Jewish person of the 1st century CE. Thus, many of the things that he said could be in the big spectrum of different types of Judaisms that existed at the time. I don't think some of the things will be more radical, less radical, but I'm sure there were other people that became less famous and not the best PR, and we don't know about them. So yeah, Paul thought Jewishly, wrote Jewishly, with obviously impact of several centuries of Greek Hellenistic influence around, and then Roman ones, but mostly Hellenistic. So, but he was not the only one. We have other people like Philo of Alexandria, another Jewish person, more or less the same time, also thinking in Greek concepts, maybe even less related to Pharisees as Paul. So we do have different type of Judaism, different concepts, and Paul did that. When if we come to the question of sexuality that Paul is mentioning, so yeah, he's mentioning that, and he's not very different than other Jewish of the time. I want to come to something that was mentioned just before our talk. I think Luke said that the issue of obsession of religions with sexuality. I think, Luke, you used that term, and I kind of was jumping because I am not sure. I mean, for me, obsession is when we believe that someone is dealing with a certain issue way more than they should, or way more than they deal with other issues. There are many rock stars that do perform now, and one is only listening to Taylor Swift. We would say, okay, they're obsessed with Taylor Swift because they don't listen to all the others. But if they listen to Taylor Swift and all the others as well, they are just the like music. I would say that I don't think the Jewish tradition is obsessed with sexuality. I think the Jewish tradition have lots of regulation about sexuality, but the Jewish tradition also have lots of regulation about food, about agriculture, about sacrifices, about damages, about holidays, about rituals, and more and more and more. So I don't think, if I look at all the system of Jewish law, I do not think that obsession will be right there. Okay. Christianity, and especially I think with Paul, maybe we come to something different, because Paul basically seemed to drop most active commandments, what later will be called most ceremonial commandments, what 1,200 years later Aquinas will say ceremonial stuff. But he does seem to keep some laws related to sexuality, but even that, not so many. If what I remember, so Paul speaks about that for him it's good to be chaste, and some people can do that, but not all have to follow that. Another thing that he says, that couples can take some break from one another for prayer, he says. He seems to speak about what we would call today homosexual relationship and condemning that. He speaks about one man, one woman. I am not sure I don't think he have any text says how to have sex. He does not seem to speak about issue of menstrual impurity, although Christian authors just a few decades later do. So I think what is interesting that Paul speaks about, I think, but even then, is he obsessed? I do not know. Paul also speaks about meat that was used in temples. Paul also speaks about people that have grudges against others. In the so-called Council of Jerusalem, they speak about circumcision, they speak about dietary laws. So they speak about different things. I'm not sure if the obsession is in the text or the obsession is in us that we found those things.
Yeah.
And I'm actually coming to exactly that point. But I want to do one more of these broad brush statements. We've already done two, and I want to do a third one, and then I'm going to bring them together into that very point. So, Evyatar, this third broad brush statement, maybe you can give us your feelings on this. This one deals with gender. It's very clear when we look at these many, many laws in the Torah that women are valued as less than men. And I mean, in a financial sense, men are clearly in charge and they're more highly valued financially, or the price that's put on their heads, literally. For example, the thank offering one would give for a newborn child was always higher, almost double for a son than for a daughter. The law prescribed a higher redemption price for a male slave than for a female slave. And there's even laws about male slaves getting their freedom, but then there's the law, one of the laws says if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as a male servant does. So clearly there's gender-based discrimination going on through these various laws in the Torah.
I would have again a problem with the term discrimination. Discrimination for me is when you assume that something, I'm not sure how to say it, but I would imagine discrimination is if someone is doing something different to different people, and if I push that person to the wall, they will say, you know what, this is not right because they are the same. And this is discrimination. But I do it anyway, or something like this. I pay more to men than to women, for example, right? We consider this discrimination with wages. Why men and women doing the same job get different salary sometimes, okay? Right, this I see as discrimination. But if the two objects are not considered to be the same, I do not see a discrimination. I just see these are treating things differently. If I I have a cat. If I give to my cat only food that is mostly, I guess, produced with some type, nothing special, but meat, because that's what cats need. And if I had a dog and I would give them also things that are not made of meat, is this discrimination? I don't think. Dogs can digest things that cats cannot. I mean, is it discrimination to say that the government give to electric cars some advantages and not to diesel cars? They decide these are two different things. In the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, men and women are different. They are defined to be different. So the fact that laws treat them differently, I do not think discrimination will be the right term. I have to say, this is not that I defend that in any way whatsoever, of course.
Right.
But they are just not the same. And I think it's clear what you say with the value. Because, I mean, it might be for certain societies, the value is different. If we think about China, when still was the one-child policy, we know that people wanted to have boys. So is this discrimination? It is, but it was in the reality of the society, in agricultural society. Sure. There were differences for the continuation. There were different between the tradition where you're older, if the girl will go away, the boy will stay with you and take care of you. So there are different advantages for different genders. And I think that's part of the reason there. So you are right. They are treated differently. I think from our perspective is unfairly because we have the Enlightenment concept and the liberal concept that all people are equal. Men, women are equal. But if you do not have that concept, this is not discrimination. These are just different laws to different things, to different entities. But the fact is that there are differences. Absolutely, yes, there are big differences. Again, this is not to defend it. This is just, I think, an observation how those things are explained there.
Yeah, it's interesting. The ancient world ran on slavery, right? And the idea of people as property, which is so abhorrent to us, was not abhorrent in the ancient world. Many people, at least, were seen as property, right? When I think of the law prescribed regarding male slaves and female slaves, kind of makes sense to me that a male slave would be worth more because male slaves perform more labor. They were, if you look at them as an object, if you look at them as just a useful machine, it kind of makes sense that you pay more for a male than a female, not because you necessarily think they're inherently ontologically better than a female. They're just more valuable to you than a female. I'm saying all this, it's abhorrent. I don't agree with any of it. But to understand this in its context, I think we have to try to take that into account.
Absolutely.
Right. And we also understand with the issue of slavery, which comes here, that we can do that mostly because we have all these machines. I had just coffee and I used a coffee grinder and I used a water boiler. I did not need to go and grind the coffee with some stones. I did not need to go to find wood to boil the water. If it'd be a lone person here, I would not have the coffee. It will take me hours just to prepare this cup of coffee. So the fact that we have all this technology, this machinery that replaces all this huge labor that was needed allows us to be different. But there, right, for many of the things, was probably about force, about who stays where, and different value was given. Of course, that for us, this is very problematic. And I am not defending the Bible in the sense because I also do not have the Protestant attitude saying the Bible is right. I am not there. So I can say the Bible is, from my perspective, this is wrong. I can understand it culturally, historically. At the time, this was part of culture. It was not different from many others. But is it right? No.
So now we come to the point where I bring all of those threads together. It may seem like we were saying different things, but actually you'll find that we were all saying the same thing. Here's where I was going with all those three threads. We talked about how there wasn't a law for 1,000 years, and then all of a sudden, over the course of 40 years, suddenly there is this law that has an inordinate attention paid to certain bodily secretions and not a lot of other ones, and a lot of attention towards which wives what we may marry, a lot of attention towards how males are valued more than females. All of this sounds a lot like males writing these laws. And where this becomes important again is when I then talk to Christians next week and 2 weeks from now, and they will say, well, it says in this Levitical law, in the law of the Torah, that's a law that God gave the Israelites. And I'm going to say, look, when we look at this more closely, it looks like a lot of these laws were written by men, by ancient Semitic men from a very distinct worldview. And I question whether a lot of these laws that we read in that text, in the Torah, as they're presented there in the text, I question whether that's God speaking or if that's men. Let's just say men speaking. That's the point I was coming to in all of those threads.
So again, I hope I will not going to be stoned, but for me, nothing falls from heaven. Maybe rain sometimes, hail. Texts did not kind of fall from heaven. They were written by people, and yet they were written by men, by cis men, we'll say, cis male, and very specific group, this group of scribe, probably people related to the temple. So those that are educated, those that could write, which was a very small group. And yes, there were probably many in Jerusalem and maybe some other places in the kingdom of Israel, in the northern kingdom. Men wrote them. Can some Christian believe in different type of inspiration, divine inspiration, what it means? Yes, there are different concepts. What does it mean? Does it mean that every word was dictated by God, or does it mean that people wrote from their own belief? These are huge question related to the issue of inspiration. I think I can speak for hours about different opinions about Jews, different opinions of Catholic, different opinions of Calvinists and Lutherans about what inspiration does mean. But if someone asks me, so who wrote this text? Guys, Israelites / at some point, also we can call them Judeans or Jews, guys wrote them. Take it or leave it.
Sure.
Okay. So we're getting very long. I want to change gears. We've been spending a lot of time in what I've referred to as Levitical laws. It's not just Leviticus, it's Numbers and Deuteronomy as well. But I want to now focus our attention on Genesis, because that's also a book that these Christians will point to. I say these Christians, I'm a Christian, but when people are defending their views on sex and gender...
I missed that.
He said no one's perfect.
No one's perfect.
When I do talk to them and they defend their views on sex and gender and sexuality, they will point to those laws, but they'll also often go straight to Genesis and talk about God creating male and female in his image. And more specifically, it actually says in their image. The plural is there. It is a plurality. So, Evyatar, how then would you see those original authors, those original peoples, because I don't think it was an author that wrote Genesis, what did they mean by God creating humans in their image? And we Christians will interpret that through a lot of Greek philosophy, but this was written 1,000 years before Greek philosophy. So what would you say was the original meaning of that idea, being created in God's image?
It was not written 1,000 years before Greek philosophy, but it was in a different area of the Mediterranean area. Actually, the time is not very far from early Greek philosophy. This is actually a verse that made hard life for Jews for many centuries because of this plural there, because Christians loved it. They says, aha, Trinity, you see, here it is. And Jews had some tough time because it does say plurality. So Jews tried, if we speak about the plurality, Jews gave different interpretation. One of the most well-known is one that is generally associated with Rashi, a commentator of the 12th century, Jewish French commentator, that says that God consulted the angels. And this shows that this is supposed to teach you that when you are going to do something major, you should consult with your subordinates. So God consulted, this is the plural, God and consulted the angels. That's about the plural. Obviously, and this is one of these texts that were tough for Jews. But the issue of the image is interesting in different authors in different times, so in different ways. Some would say the image, actual, hands, feet, body, and that led to different things. That led, on the one hand, it was used by some Christian church fathers to see that this is a type of allegory, a prophecy for the actual creation of a God that is in a man that is in God image, known as Christ or Jesus in this case. Some cases, there were Jews that said that God has a body, just like humans. And there was a text, it was called Shiur Koma, was pretty popular. It seemed like around 8th, 7th, 10th century, so cool. And later, that actually gave the size of God, described God's hand is this size, God, it's like huge numbers. But because if we are like God, then God is like us, and we have to describe the size of God. So you have that. You also have those that would say the image is different things that are attributed to God. Thinking, wisdom, love, whatever, different culture, different groups said this is the concept of image. Yeah, I think those are different. But you also see, again, in the Bible itself, you see moments in which the Bible does not seem to say that God has no body. Moses wants to see God, and God is saying you could, but it's not going to be good because you'll die. That means that there is somebody. There is another text that on the Sinai that the elders see something with some color that looks to be different, right? So the idea that there is some actual similarity between God and human seems to be found in the Hebrew Bible. We are now descendants of medieval philosophy that did not like anthropomorphism, did not like the idea that God has a body. Again, Aquinas, Maimonides for Jews and others. But, I think we often say if you ask a child to do a picture of God, and they will do this old guy with a white beard, like a Santa Claus style person. I think that many people in the biblical time would be totally fine with it, with some kind of version of it. Gods had images. This was not rare. God were described with visuals. So I think initially there was something like that. There is some similarity between them, but it's true that later both Jews and Christians could not, most of them, or many of them, could not live with this concept. In different ways. Christian actually, again, with Christ, lived very well with it, actually did it big time, saying, yes, God is fully incarnate, there is a divine human thing.
Okay.
The two groups had different ways to deal with this concept.
Okay, so the reason I'm asking this question is, again, there are Christians who will point to this passage when they want to talk about certain forms of sexuality. They would say it degrades the image that God created in us in some way. They see it as a degradation of the image that God created us with. And yet I'm asking then, what was this concept of the image of God? Does it have anything to do with sex or sexuality or even gender? It talks about being created male and female. So it's not, we give God a gender for some reason. We always seem to need to refer to him in the male pronoun. But my question fundamentally is this. When Christians do point to this and say it degrades the image that God gave us, does that image have anything to do with sex or sexuality?
I'll find it extremely bizarre, such claim, because that means that if people, let's say people that I guess use it against premarital sex or gay sex or whatever sex they don't like, so I guess the assumption is that God is heterosexual, did not have sex before he got married, and have it only with one only wife. And then they say, because the humans are in this image, then if they do differently than that God, then they degrade the image. That's a Greek pantheon story. That's not, so to say that, I cannot see why certain type of sex are considered to be godly and certain aren't, unless you say that God has sex, which, okay, fine if they want to, but I think those same people will be terrified even more if I will tell them, okay, that means that God has sex, but in the right way, with some family values. So I honestly cannot understand the logic of a statement like this.
What is the attitude toward homosexuality in the Jewish community in general? Maybe that's too broad a question, but
it's extremely broad a question. First, to say the vast majority of Jews today are not observant. About maybe 80% of Jews are not observant, so they will generally have the same attitude as their average neighbors. Some will be for, against, whatever. Generally, Jews in this country, the United States, not in Canada as well, will be on, most of them will be on the liberal side.
Okay.
So will not have issues with that. But in more traditional societies, there will be different opinions. I mean, and I think it will be very much similar to the general change in cultures today. I'm not embarrassed to say, I said it to students a few times. If you would have asked me when I was 20, can two men get married? I would say you're out of your mind. Of course not. Men and women, that's marriage. What I think is not marriage. If you ask me today, can two men get married? I would say you're out of your mind. What's the problem? Of course. I changed. Yeah. Many of us changed. Obama was against gay marriage when he got to the White House. And a few years after, the White House was with rainbow colors. Right? It was a huge, and I think I can say the three of us are more or less of the same generation. We've seen that change, and it was extremely fast. And it happened. I mean, students today do not realize how things were different. And I think that's also true for religious communities of all types. Can be Jews, some Christians, Muslims, Catholic. Things change. People accept it more and more in some places not, because it's a radical, like to be a counter act. And that will be very diverse. You will find the Jewish Orthodox communities that will say no, and you will find there are some openly gay Orthodox rabbis. So you have everything.
Okay. Would it be similar in the broad umbrella of Christianity? It tends to be the most fundamentalist, the most conservative, that are the most against things like homosexuality. Would you say the same thing is true in Judaism, that the more orthodox in a sense, or the more strict, the less favorable they are towards things like homosexuality and so on?
I think we come here to the very definition of the term conservative. So if conservative meaning someone that believes that things should be the way they believe that the things have been, which in both cases is very tricky if it's someone is rewriting history. So groups that believe that in the past gay marriage was not acceptable and if they see themselves conservative, would believe that today it should not be the same. So I think that would be a similar thing. And I think also the change is similar. It could be, one can be an Orthodox, strict Orthodox person, or a very strict Southern Baptist person, and be against gay marriage. And then one day their kid comes and say, "Daddy, I'm gay." And then they will have to think what to do. Some will say, "You see the door, go out, never come back." Some would say, "You know what, let's talk," and everything in between. And I think that would be the same there.
Yeah. No, fair. That's fair. Thank you.
So we were asking you, Evyatar, your scholars' understanding of what Jews would have meant by this term being made in God's image. I also want to get your thoughts on another phrase that's often attached to that. Jesus said, for example, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And maybe before I say too much more, Evyatar, as a scholar of Judaism and also of Jewish and Christian thinking over history, what's going on in that phrase there? Especially this phrase, the two will become one flesh. What is the original meaning, as you see it, of that phrase?
Jesus quotes with minor modification. Jesus quotes Genesis there.
Right.
He's not inventing this concept. He quotes a verse from Genesis. In Genesis, this seems to be like the uniting of men and women. Now, he is doing that in the concept of divorce. That's what if I remember correctly.
Exactly.
Right? So he's taking it in the Hebrew. In Genesis, it's not about divorce. It's actually about marriage. And he is using it in the context of speaking against divorce. The issue of this becoming one flesh is understood in different ways by, again, different Jewish authors. One way will be the actual act of intercourse is supposedly combining two people into one in some metaphoric way, that will be becoming one, or the idea that by having a child, the child is a combination of the two. I mean, for us with knowledge of DNA, we actually say that's kind of true. So these are generally the two major ways how it is understood, the becoming one. Or just, let's say, less graphic, just the idea of one household, one social unit. So maybe you could think about these three. The social unit, one social unit, the act of intercourse as uniting two bodies, or creating of a third body, which is created by both.
And so the context in which Christians will often point to this passage would be that, for example, in premarital sex, they'll say you can't have sex before marriage because in the process you become one flesh with this person, but then you break apart, you rip this thing apart, and now you're only ever half of a person and you're always wounded. And I'm asking, is there any merit to that kind of logic that's applied? Christians using that passage to say you can't have sex with somebody because then you become that one flesh and you can't rip that apart. You'll always be one flesh. Is that the original intent of that phrase?
I don't think, but I would ask those Christian people that say that, what happens when you get divorced? So but that point, if you marry someone else, is this ménage à trois, à quatre, à fif, whatever, a cinq, because if you cannot, I think it's an absolute hypocrisy to say to young people, if you have premarital sex and then you are with another person that's part of that person remain with you, but when we're in our 30s or 40s and 50s and 60s, we get divorced and we marry someone else, then we left that previous person alone, as nothing of them is remaining with us in bed. I do not see the logic there. So if I would have been a young Christian evangelical person, I would be extremely not impressed by that argument. I do know there is in some circles, I have a friend that many years worked on what the so-called STDs, sexually transmitted demons, which is a concept that is found in some evangelical circles. The idea that by uniting with the wrong person, you actually create some evil forces. She did not invent the term. It is actually used by them. And I think it's similar to this. But again, I would love if you explain to me, Luke, why the difference between divorce and premarital sex, why one is legit and the other is not.
That's what I will ask them then, because I don't see these laws.
Send me please the answer.
Pardon me?
Send me their answer. I would be curious because I cannot see, other than kind of ageism, to say that young people...
Yeah, ageism. I might be able to give a partial answer. We'll see what they have to say. But there certainly are some amongst conservative theologians that would argue that divorce is it. You can't remarry after divorce. So they would probably say, their position would probably be consistent, because they would say, well, no, if you're divorced, you can't remarry. And that's a pretty common, well, it's becoming less, but that's been a pretty common opinion for many.
That would be the Catholic and in some ways the Orthodox concept. The idea that when people say there's no divorce in Catholicism, this is wrong. There is divorce. There is no remarriage. So the idea that as long as the spouse is alive, you will still have them in bed, even if you were someone else. So you shouldn't.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the part where I always have to say we're running out of time here. There's many things on our list of questions and topics to discuss, but we just don't have the time to go through them all. But we can't do an episode on sex in the Bible and not talk for at least a few minutes about Song of Songs. Some refer to this as Solomon's Song of Songs. It's a book of the Bible that is never read out loud within the walls of any evangelical church, and I suspect not in any Jewish synagogue either. You can tell us about that, Evyatar. Because the words on face value are just too much for puritanical ears, and I understand that rules have been made about a minimum age that one must have before they can read from this book. And I don't know if you know this, Evyatar, but many Christians try to get around that provocative imagery in this book by somehow taking the phrases which are otherwise all about two horny teenagers engaged in foreplay and reinterpreting those as God's spiritual love for the church. But once again, Evyatar, this was written within a Jewish context, and you are the Jewish scholar. So can you tell us what were they trying to say, and why did they include this in their canon of inspired literature?
The Song of Songs is something interesting, that it's a book that clearly was written as erotic marriage something, but was saved from oblivion by the fact that both Jews and Christians very early, maybe 1st century CE, maybe even before, for Jews, interpreted it as an allegory. So Jews said this is about God and the Jewish people, or this is about the Jewish people and the Torah, and Christians said this is about Christ and the church, or God and the church. So this is not. You think this is about a guy chasing a woman or a woman chasing a guy? No way. This is about Christ looking for his church, right? So the fact that it was really very early saved from that. But yeah, it's a cool book. And I remember as it's read once a year. In Sephardi synagogue, it's read every Friday evening. In Ashkenazi synagogue, it's read once a year. And I remember as a child, when there are some of these verses of different body parts, that I remember I was like looking at all the guys and right, what the heck is going on here? But all these forbidden words that are there. But it's an interesting book for sure.
Why would it use such graphic imagery to describe such a spiritual, and people would say a holy thing? You know, God pursuing the church, God pursuing Israel. Why would it use such graphic imagery?
Because it was not written like that. That was not the real reason. The real reason, this is some kind of, seems to be, many scholars think it's like some kind of marriage poetry, marriage hymns that were used in ceremonies. It was not written to describe God and the Torah or the Jews and Christ and all that. It was the way it was interpreted. In a way, it's a similar thing. Like we go back to one of the first questions when you say why the Bible did not simply say don't have sex with anybody other than your wife. And I said because the Bible did not think that way. I think it's the same thing here. It doesn't say that this is. It used all this imagery because it was about the images. It was not about the later interpretation. But luckily, the later interpretation saved it because, as I say often to students, they have to remember that old texts needed to be saved. There's so much water, fire, and mice that would love to take care of old texts. So if text was not copied and recopied, it would have been gone. And copying is a costly and complicated process. You really need to want to copy something. And that actually saved those texts. They save, okay, they are meaningful even for us. They're not just like some old wedding song. They are meaningful theologically. Let's copy them. And it saved.
You could say the same thing about the book of Job, which I think it's almost a minor miracle that some of these books made it in, but like you said, they were valued. People recognized in them, Ecclesiastes being another one, that people recognized there was truth in these books.
Okay, we are running out of time. There's very little time left. Evyatar, any major projects on the horizon, any books or speaking engagements that are coming up?
My most recent book, as you said, was about Jewish sexual practices, the guidance. But as you said, I'm dealing with Jews and Catholics. So my other book, which I think is more fun in some ways, not related to anything here, was about Sting, a guy that I think people in more or less our generation know. Many young people do not, but a good guy.
Yeah.
So it was about how Catholic upbringing shaped an artist. So it's specifically about him, but it's more general about the idea how, especially Catholics that were born around the 1950s, 1960s, the type of Catholicism that they absorbed and how it is reflected in his work. So this is another project that I have. And I have fun with moving between Jews and Catholics because when I'm too mad in one, I'm going to the other. That's how it works for me.
Okay. And we're going to leave links in the show notes for people finding your material, including a link for that book on Sting and his music. Thank you very much, Evyatar, for giving us your wisdom, your experience, and your opinions on this.
It was very interesting. We talk about lots of interesting things here, for sure. It was a pleasure. It was fun. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks again.
You too. Bye-bye.
See you later.
So after all this discussion that we've had today and last week's discussion as well, I have to ask, is it really God who's so concerned about sex and gender, or is it us humans, especially us human males? Are we using God and religion and holy books to control something, to keep it in a bottle, or maybe to keep it away from other people? And have we held on so tightly to that precious thing in our wrestling over it that we've bent it, we've distorted it, broken it, and squeezed the life out of it? Why have we attached so much shame and guilt and condemnation to this thing? Those are some of the questions that we'll be asking and exploring over the next few weeks when we discuss this further with Christian and evangelical scholars.
Yeah, we'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.